God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Len Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business. Our subtext is Let My Business Go, and we'll have guests from around the world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. It's a delight to have Jay Jakub here with us. Jay, welcome.
Thank you, Brett. Great to be here.
Good. Where are you today?
I'm just outside of Washington, D.C. in the United States.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you here. I know a lot of your work is international, and I'm excited to speak with you on this really, really important topic because you've done a fascinating amount of work with corporates, with big companies. I was just reading a survey yesterday that was saying, the approval rating of different things, capitalism, socialism, capitalism outweighed socialism, and probably the worst approval rating goes to government and then to big corporations. But yes, you've been doing a lot of work that would suggest that corporations are actually up to some good things, and I look forward to exploring it with you.
Absolutely, and in fact, to your point, when Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Business professor, that when he created financial capitalism 50 years ago, there was about 100 of the top economies by Milton Friedman. All 100 of the top economies in terms of size were nation states. And now something like 69 of the top 100 economies are actually multinational corporations. Yeah. So corporations must play a significant role in addressing the most important challenges of society and the environment because there's nobody else.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I remember when, in the olden days, Ireland used to be very much a church-run country almost. And but when business took over, there was a guy, I think his name was Seamus O'Geary or something like that, an Irish name, said that business now had a responsibility for society was because it was no longer the church that was the center of society, but business was. And so this is a particularly relevant topic. And so Jay, tell me, how did you get into this? What is your background? And how did you get into all of this?
Yes, thanks for the question. I actually joined a company that's quite iconic, a food and beverage company that's known really for chocolate, called Mars Incorporated, at the start of 2007, working in the global headquarters as part of the leadership team of the internal think tank of that corporation. And Mars is about maybe a $40 billion in terms of revenue business annually that employs about 130,000 what are called associates. And it's owned entirely by the Mars family. So that's the Mars name rather than the planet. So it's family owned, privately held. And it was a real privilege to be part of that organization for almost 14 years, actually, in helping the chief economist, who is the managing director of the internal think tank there, lead that think tank. Prior to that, I had spent actually about almost 17 years in government. So this move to Mars Incorporated, the makers of M&Ms, among other things, was really a major life transition into business for me. And little did I know when I joined Mars that one of the three family owners of the company, John Mars, was about to change the trajectory of my life by asking his chief executive officer, his CEO at that time, a remarkable question, which was, what should the right level of profit be for the company? And this was really an unusual question coming from a shareholder. We took a look at in the internal think tank when this question was given to us by the CEO, and we couldn't find anything in the management literature that suggested that this was a question that was comprehensively tackled or even asked by shareholders who just assumed that the more profit you get would be the answer to a question like that. But John was thinking very differently about you're only as strong as the weakest link in your value chain. Yeah. And if you take too much profit, more than is your right, you actually could create some sort of disequilibrium that could really hurt your company. Yeah. And we started to think about this, and I'm a historian actually by interest and academic training long ago. Yeah. And so I like to look back sometimes to look forward, and came across this this interesting word in Proverbs, in the book of Proverbs by King Solomon, which was a man may give freely and still his wealth will be increased, and another may keep back more than is right, but only comes to be in need. So far from being a new question that was being asked, the right level of profit, it really was a very old question that mankind's been wrestling with for a long time. So that question actually set our internal think tank on a course to create a business model management innovation that we eventually called the Economics of Mutuality, which really rests on the presumption that the ends never justify the means. That actually, especially in business, we need to focus on the means, how we treat the others in an ecosystem of stakeholders, and be faithful in the small things. And if we do that, then the ends, which would be your profit, will actually take care of themselves. And this was really quite a change for me, having worked in government in places that often believe the opposite, which was the ends always justify the means. And I know for a fact in my own belief system that they never actually justify the means. So I'm sure we're going to talk more about economics of mutuality today, so I'll leave it there. But I have to say that, it's been quite a blessing being able to be in the leadership of this work, the economics of mutuality, because it's been something that's vocational for me, which is a word you probably understand. It's really about my personal purpose being married together with my purpose during the workday. And as a result, it's created a much more seamless life, if I could use that term, than I would have had in any other situation I could imagine.
Fantastic. So if you're a kid, the answer to the question, how much Mars chocolate is enough? The answer is, as much as you can get. That's not about profit. As much as you can get. And in the business world, it was how much profit. It's just like as much as you can get. And that was the traditional thinking for many years. When I say many years, in the last 100 years or so. So it's fascinating that a company that's dealing in chocolates and candy and so forth realized you can have more than enough. So that's fascinating.
One of my earliest childhood memories, Brett, was being able to reach up as a little tyke and reach into this bowl filled with M&Ms. So when I wound up joining Mars, it was really the fulfillment of a prophecy, maybe, or a dream for me.
Well, I have had a graphic artist who came and worked with me for 3 months or so from South Africa, and I paid him in M&Ms. It was quite simple. I just kept him stacked and he was good to go. Yeah, so fascinating. So you've got this, you alluded to vocation versus occupation, and that's a hot topic right now, with the great resignation going on, people saying with the pandemic and so on, what do I really want to do? Do I want to go into the office? Do I want to drive into Washington, D.C. or New York City every day? Is my life just about, 50, 60 hours a week, or am I made for something more? So this vocation versus occupation question seems to be a hot topic again on people's minds.
No, it sure is. And it's really an essential part of our work as well. One of the things I'd be happy to talk about in greater depth as we go along in this interview is really how we look at 4 forms of capital rather than just financial capital, which is only one form of capital among these 4. And one of the other forms of capital that businesses tend to ignore is what's called human capital. And we have figured out a way in which we can collect the kind of data that'll give us a really solid insight in any corporate culture into what really matters to employees of a company. So what are the true drivers of their well-being? And once you know the true drivers of well-being, you really can start to craft interventions, through the human resources type of space to grow those things that are most important, those true drivers of well-being. And when you do that, you kind of get 3 significant benefits that are really important in today's economy, one of which is talent attraction. And most HR professionals will tell you that, we're in a war for talent. There's just not enough talent, people that are trained and skilled in the kinds of jobs that are being created in the new economy of today. And also, people are resigning, they're not joining. So if you're not fulfilling people's purpose, you're really going to have trouble with talent attraction. The second is talent retention. Yeah. Talent retention is in some ways even more important because it's the best and the brightest who are the first to jump ship, the ones you've invested the most in. If they're not satisfied, if their purpose isn't being met, if their vocation isn't being addressed, or if the company is operating in a way that's contrary to what their belief system is. And then the third is really optimization of performance. So it really pays to start thinking about these other forms of capital as having significant value to the company. Yeah. And yet, financial capitalism only values one.
So Jay, it's very expensive it's expensive to hire people. It's expensive to lose people. I used to say it would take me about 18 months to get somebody productive in an organization. So it's a big investment. And then, so nowadays, as people are just thinking about rolling over their careers pretty quickly, this is a big deal. And so back in 2000, I wrote a book called Convergence: How Do You Integrate Your Career, Creativity, Calling, Community? It's a big deal. And so, to be able to connect purpose and work, vocation and occupation, career and calling is fascinating, and it pays dividends. It's actually not just something that's an optional extra. I really think, and particularly with the new gen, I don't want to just call them millennials because there's always a generation after that, but for them, I say the favorite wine of a millennial is, why won't somebody pay me to do what I'm passionate about? But that's what they want, right? They want to.
No, it's true. And part of that's because the social contract between corporations and people has materially changed. And in some ways, people think that social contract is broken. There was a time when people just wanted to have stable work and guaranteed employment, for a lifetime, and they were willing to exchange loyalty to the company for having that job security. And now people have really been commoditized by corporations, and so it's really easy to swap people in and out, or at least corporations have thought that, and that social contract has really frayed. And so now it's really about, are you meeting my purpose, my passion, my calling? And if you're not, you are going to hemorrhage your workforce. There's no doubt about it.
So Jay, so you've ended up at Mars. You've been working there, and then you go forward, and you actually. This becomes more mainstream. And tell us about your connection in with, firstly, the book Completing Capitalism. And it says, the subtitle, Heal Business to Heal the World. And tell us a little bit about the subtitle, the concept of healing a business. And I was actually thinking this morning, when I was reflecting on the fact that we'd be having a conversation years ago, the Mahatma Gandhi was asked what he thought about Western civilization. And he said he thought it would be a good idea. And I was thinking about capitalism, same thing. Capitalism, because capitalism has become really greed and materialism. And as we look around the world, there's not really a healthy place where you see healthy capitalism. So I loved seeing Completing Capitalism and the healing of business. Unpack that a bit for us, Jay.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to unpack sort of both the title and the subtitle, because a lot went into that. And I can remember when we were trying with the president of our publisher, who was personally editing the book from a place called Barrett Kohler out in California. We were really struggling with the name. And so really, I remember just praying about this and just getting this download, Completing Capitalism. And then my co-author, Bruno Rush, who was the chief economist of Mars, he did the same thing, and he got the Heal Business to Heal the World. So we just put them together. And over time, I've really come to appreciate this, because the Completing Capitalism, first of all, is very disarming. It is not ideological, and it's not political. And I found, as one of the kind of main spokespeople for this topic, I mean, I'm the chief advocacy officer for the EOM, Economics of Mutuality movement. So I do quite a lot of public speaking on this topic, and also, meet privately with different types of organizations. And I find that people who are coming more from the perspective of the left, they look at capitalism as an evil very often. But when they see Completing Capitalism, this is kind of disarming, because they think, okay, it's incomplete. You recognize it's incomplete, so something has to be done to evolve it, to make it better, and to make it fairer. And then the people who are more sort of the free marketeers, who are more right of center, who would really defend capitalism to the death, they look at Completing Capitalism and they say, actually, is capitalism, financial capitalism, is that sort of an early version of capitalism, something that's more rudimentary, and can it be completed in such a way that it becomes more valuable? And actually, one of the things that I like to say about Completing Capitalism is the fact that financial capitalism of 50 years ago, of Milton Friedman, that's dominated everything from the way business is taught in MBA programs to how businesses operate all around the world. I mean, it only values one form of capital, which is money, financial capital, because economics is the management of scarcity. So 50 years ago, in the global economy, there was a scarcity of money. There was a surplus of natural resources. There was a surplus of labor. So it's not surprising that somebody stepped forward with a model to address this form of scarcity, which was money. Well, 50 years later, we have a radical change in the nature of scarcity, and we have exactly the opposite conditions. We have way too much financial capital in the global economy, a dysfunctional amount, and it's getting worse because this model hasn't changed. Really, it's pumping out more and more money. And when it comes to natural resources, we're in a severe shortfall of that now. And talent, matching jobs that are being created in the new economy, is also creating a scarcity of labor. But labor and natural resources are really not valued, because in business, you only manage what you measure. So if you don't measure the right way the impact of people and planet on your business, and your business operations, you're really going to be lost. So I think expanding the definition of performance for business to include social capital, human capital, and natural capital, which I can unpack further later if you'd like. This is about making capitalism more complete. When it comes to healing, this approach called Economics of Mutuality, which we lay out in this book, Completing Capitalism, is not just a clever way to make more money in the current context. It's really about being faithful in the small things and how you treat your neighbor, who in the case of business is your stakeholder, not necessarily your shareholder. So who are those that you need to bring together around a sense of shared purpose to deliver value to the consumer, to deliver the purpose that you say your business actually stands for? And how you treat the others is really materially different than how much value can you extract from the others, which is kind of the Friedman approach of financial capitalism. And we find that, the relationship between business and people is really broken in many ways. And so this approach, Economics of Mutuality, is really about healing those broken relationships between business and people, empowering people, setting the captives free, so to speak. And similarly, nature is enslaved to business, who treats nature almost as a free resource. And so this is also about healing the relationship between business and the environment. And then I'm also finding, just on a personal level, that those who get involved in Economics of Mutuality, both recipients of the benefits of it, but also those who are leading it, we also wind up experiencing a lot of personal healing, which I certainly have myself, and I've witnessed quite a bit of that in others as well. So there's something of a real blessing in this work.
In fact, I've experienced some of that myself on the personal healing side, Jay. If you'd like to go a bit deeper on that, because one of my observations over the years is, you've seen the statistics. People work in the big corporate, they retire, 18 months later they're dead, and part of that is the friction between who they're designed to be, how they're designed to work, and what corporates have required, or be it government or business or the world of education, capital, whatever. And there's a longing for resetting, for realignment, for something to be a bit better. Did you experience some of that? And what was that in your life?
Very much so. So, I mean, we live in a broken world, and I think it's safe to say that all of us are broken by this broken world to some degree. And, we may never be entirely whole, but the pursuit of becoming more whole and more healed is something that I think needs to be on all of our hearts. And I find this work is so fulfilling in terms of achieving a more meaningful purpose that's just beyond, the routine of life. That I've experienced physical healing, I've experienced emotional healing, and spiritual healing as well. And I've seen that in many others as well, because again, you're resetting business from a mindset where if you want to have as a shareholder, you need to take from others and keep for yourself. That's kind of an underlying premise of the current model that dominates everything, to a model that's about giving to receive. That actually, if you focus more on orchestrating solutions to the problems of people and planet, rather than profiting by creating problems for people and planet, you're actually going to be bringing healing to those stakeholders. And we actually have a methodology that is called ecosystem orchestration, which is about mapping out the stakeholders in an ecosystem that includes the business, but that the stakeholders are grouped around a sense of shared purpose, which is the purpose of the business activity, framed in such a way that it's helping someone else rather than just trying to create more profit for yourself. And by identifying through clinical interviews of the key stakeholders what we call the pain points, what are the things that are ailing, that are inhibiting the stakeholders from delivering their full part of the purpose that brought them together with the business in this ecosystem of stakeholders. we find that we can heal those pain points through select interventions by the corporation that they would never think of doing otherwise if they're just focused on return on investment. And by orchestrating solutions to the problems of their key stakeholders, they make their key stakeholders much more performant in helping the business deliver that purpose. And when you become more performant, you wind up with a much better outcome, both holistically and financially, even in the short term, and you have a more resilient business as well. So this is all tied back to healing rather than to taking.
Yeah. And the thing which keeps people aligned and moving forward in an innovative way is a common purpose that they agree upon. And that purpose is bigger than making money, bigger than shareholder value, bigger than a pension plan or whatever. It's actually, you're striving for an alignment between the purpose of a corporation and the purpose of an individual. And then figuring out how you can do that with all the stakeholders. And of course, that now goes into the community where the business is doing business. I would imagine Mars has thought that through in terms of where the cacao beans are grown and how much the farmers are paid and the intermediaries and so forth. That must have been quite a process to unpack, because from what I understand, the cacao industry has the second highest bonded labor. I think probably cotton might be one of the highest, but and so they would have had to look back all the way into their supply chain. It's not just something you did in the corporate office, I'm sure.
Yes, and actually, cocoa, most of the high-grade cocoa in the world is grown in West Africa. And Mars, unlike other chocolate competitor companies, is not vertically integrated, meaning that it doesn't own its own cocoa plantations, for example, in places like Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana. Instead, it buys all its cocoa on the secondary market. Nonetheless, because it's the largest single buyer of cocoa in the world, I think the last time I looked, Mars was buying about 9 or 10% of all of the cocoa available in the world, that there was really a sense of responsibility to the smallholder farmers in particular, and focusing really on Cote d'Ivoire, which just produces a massive amount of cocoa, but in a really, really inefficient fashion, and there's a lot of abject poverty there. So Mars has a lot of sustainability initiatives in that space to try to improve cocoa production and the lives of people there. That's materially different than what we're doing with the Economics of Mutuality, which is a business model management innovation, not a sustainability initiative. But we're doing work in West Africa as well with Mars, with cocoa farmers, but really trying to apply this approach in such a way that we can better adapt these non-financial forms of capital to gaining the trust of the community. I mean, something called social capital, which we work with as a key building block of Economics of Mutuality, is really defined as trust, social cohesiveness, and the capacity to work collectively in the community. And after doing quite a bit of field work on this for multiple years, we discovered we can measure social capital with the same sort of simplicity, scientific robustness, and uniformity and standardization as you can measure financial capital, but it's a different kind of capital. And it's very important in a place like Cote d'Ivoire to focus on initiatives to grow the social capital, the trust in that community. And we find that there's this very strong correlation between non-financial forms of capital like social capital and your economic performance, meaning your financial performance. So if we can grow the social capital among these cocoa farmers as part of the business activity of Mars in those places, that actually we can accelerate the uptake of some of these other initiatives to improve the volume of cocoa that's grown and the quality of it, but also the well-being of the lives of those cocoa farmers.
Mm. So years ago, I picked up a book. I was on my way back from Indonesia, going through the airport in Hong Kong, and a book title caught my eye. It was called Spiritual Capital. And so I picked it up and I read it, and it was not written by guys who were vaguely religious in any kind of way. And it was, I suppose in the old days in accounting terms, we talked a bit about goodwill and you could put a value on that. Now here you're talking about social capital. And I think in the past, there's been a bit of an excuse that said, well, we can't really measure that soft stuff, but we can measure numbers. We can measure production turnover, these type of things. But you've actually dealt a bit of a death knell to that concept that you can't measure things that are more holistic. And
I mean, working for the chief economist, I think, was a real benefit for us because, it's all about measurement, it's all about metrics. And so that was our starting point. Was we knew about from the management literature that there were other forms of capital other than financial, social, human, and natural. but businesses didn't know how to measure these fuzzy things, like you said. And so they thought they were too complex and they couldn't understand the connection between them and financial capital. So they pretty much ignored them. And that basically left on the table for businesses an enormous amount of value that companies create and destroy through their business activities. They create social, human, and natural capital, or they destroy them through their management practices. And so we literally spent in the internal think tank, this being just one project among multiple projects, we spent almost 5 years trying to crack the measurement of this work. We started it in 2007 when we got that question from John Mars, what should the right level of profit be? And we thought, okay, the starting point is businesses only manage what they measure. So let's start with measuring the non-financial forms of capital. And when we finally cracked the measurement piece of that, and we created a way that we could have the same quality in terms of the output of the measurement as we would if we were measuring something much more tangible like financial capital. But we also found it was really standardized and it was really uniform no matter where you measured it, no matter what the market conditions were. And then we had a second breakthrough almost very quickly on the back of the measurement breakthrough, which was finding this very strong provable correlation between how much social, human, or natural capital you were creating or destroying and your top and bottom line. Okay, so if you think about a traditional CSR, a corporate social responsibility initiative, which is really more about making the company look good, but it's meant to do some good, but always at a trade-off of profit, or even a very important sustainability type initiative, which is very expensive. It does good things, it makes the company more responsible, but it also implies a trade-off of profit to do some good for people and planet. When you have to trade off profit every time you do something good, you're stuck in a cycle where you can't scale. And if you can't scale because the initiative isn't profitable enough to be self-sustaining, which is the prerequisite for scalability, which itself is the prerequisite for transformation, then you're just kind of putting Band-Aids on problems. You're not transforming business for society and the environment. And without this trade-off, now we know you grow the social, human, and natural capital as part of your business activity, and you are going to have a more profitable business. Very often 2 times the retained earnings can come out of an approach like this. You're freed from the bondage of trade-offs.
So these trade-offs, would you say that CSR, CSI, even some of the ESG stuff is really just a corporate expression of dichotomy, the secular sacred dichotomy? It's just that worked out on a P&L. On a balance sheet.
It could be. I think there was good intent behind CSR, and then when this trade-off really handcuffed CSR's ability to really transform, then it started to become more of a business reputation, corporate reputation sort of thing, and sustainability sometimes has the reputation of greenwashing, as does ESG investing. And the problem with ESG investing is that everybody sort of rushed into ESG investing. I think there's something like $53 trillion of assets under management now that are related to ESG investing. And yet all of these metrics that are tied to ESG investing are not linked to performance. So there's no value creation that can be discerned between addressing these ESG metrics and actually creating more value for society, the environment, or the shareholder. So, one of the things we're trying to figure out is, how can we move the world from ESG into the kinds of metrics that are about value creation, holistic value creation, but also, profit value creation as well.
Yeah. Hence the mutuality piece, just so much more powerful. So the power of integration versus this separation of things. We'll make money, whatever, and then we'll do some good with it, which is really just the relocation of a problem. And so I love the idea of what you're doing. Now, you've been doing some work with Oxford University. Is that right, Jay?
We have indeed. And back in 2014, I think it was, we realized that we had enough data from the internal work we were doing at Mars on Economics of Mutuality that it was time to take EOM into an academic institution, because we thought it was time to kind of co-create a management theory that if we were really going to change the world over time with this approach, that we needed to be able to create a teaching curriculum with a management theory, and at the MBA level, most certainly, but also at the executive education level. And so we kind of had that revelation, and we thought, okay, that's the direction we need to go. And then we kind of reverted back into our own understanding of the natural world, which was a mistake. And we thought, okay, who has the most resource, the most influence, the most thorough weight in academia. And we went to institutions like Harvard Business School, Wharton, MIT, INSEAD, and we said, okay, this is what we've got. Would you like to partner with us? And much to our surprise, they all came back and said, absolutely, we want to partner with you. And then we kind of had a pause, and we started to try to understand what their motivations were. And we kind of got a sense, I don't mean to pick on them because they're important institutions, but we got a sense that they didn't share the passion for what it was that they were doing. They just liked the idea of partnering with Mars, and they would get money for that. And we started to think of them as kind of not having the cleanest hands in terms of their role in propagating the old way, in the old wineskin of the Friedman financial capitalism model, even well past the sell-by date of this. So we stepped back from this and said, okay, we're not going to accept any of those offers, and we're going to pray about it. And we did. And we were both led, Bruno and I, to Oxford. And interestingly, Oxford is where I had done my doctorate many years before, even before there was a business school at Oxford, because they used to say at Oxford very snootily, business is not the business of Oxford, until they realized it was. And they created a business school, but this business school was only, a couple of decades old. So it was very, very young, and it had a focus on social business. And it even had the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship embedded in it. So it was attracting a different kind of MBA student, one that was really interested in kind of the next generation, the new wineskin that we were looking for. And then there was a professor there by the name of Colin Mayer, who was one of the early deans of the Said Business School. And Colin had just written a book that was called Firm Commitment: How Business Has Lost the Trust of the Consumer and What It Can Do about Winning It Back, something like that. But he hadn't published it yet. And I remember I had dinner with Colin, and I said, okay, this is what we've got from Economics of Mutuality. He didn't say a word at dinner, and I thought, okay, maybe I misinterpreted all of this, and he's not going to be the right partner. And then Colin said, I'm really speechless. I'm speechless because I just wrote this book, Firm Commitment, and I spent the last 5 years of my life trying to figure out how to explain how businesses lost the trust of the consumer. And I was planning on spending the next 5 years of my life trying to figure out what companies could do about it. And here you come forward with something that's very mature, that is addressing that very issue. Can I be, the lead, and Oxford be the partner with you on this? And that started a very, very profitable, in terms of intellectual capital, I guess, a partnership with Colin Mayer and with Oxford University's Business School that's into its 8th year now. And we do a number of different things with Oxford to promote the Economics of Mutuality, and to do research that's collaborative around it, to co-publish articles in peer-reviewed journals. We have an Oxford Economics of Mutuality laboratory that's embedded in the Said Business School that we fund, and that Colin has been leading. And we also have had 6 now flagship events with our Oxford partners. Every year we have an annual Economics of Mutuality forum at Oxford that over the last 2 years has been virtual. And that's been helping to build a global movement and to bring other corporations into the discussion and things that they're doing that are very compatible with what Economics of Mutuality is about. And we also have an Economics of Mutuality executive education program that we do at Oxford that we've done 4 runnings now of as well. And we just graduated a class of 85 senior executives from all around the world, different companies, and Mars as well. So that relationship with Oxford has been kind of our flagship, although we do have other academic partners in different parts of the world also.
That's very exciting, Jay, and a lot of great progress, and certainly impacting the thinking of many leaders. So that's fantastic. Well done.
Thank you. And we've actually published some books on this topic. In addition to the first one I wrote with Bruno Roche, Completing Capitalism, we just published a new book with our Oxford partners. There were about 30 different co-authors, and it was called Putting Purpose into Practice: The Economics of Mutuality, published by Oxford University Press in March of this year. And we're happy to say that on our Economics of Mutuality website, which is eom.org, we actually have worked out an arrangement with Oxford University Press where we can offer a free download of the entire book. And so it kind of takes the journey further and really talks about practical application in many ways. So that's one of the things that's come out of this partnership as well.
That's fantastic. We'll put that in the show notes, so eom.org, and they can go and look for that new book. Fantastic. That's great. Yeah, I love that. Now, in some respects, you've had to go back to the roots of economics, right? So if you go back to the old system of economics, when the nation of Israel trekked out of Egypt and headed towards a new future, there was a realignment of economic thinking, because Prior to that, it was almost this notion of limited resources. If you get more, I get less. But what was being taught to the nation of Israel was no, that's not the way it is. And I noticed in your book on Completing Capitalism, you got to the topic of Jubilee. And in a simplistic way, I've seen people of faith, particularly Christians, who look at a topic, it's about the one scripture they know about economics. Well, just give everything back every 50 years. And it's almost a simplistic understanding of Jubilee. And yet this notion of Sabbath and Jubilee, of rest and so forth is built into your thinking. So you reached back into that old Israeli Jewish type thinking, and you've brought that forward into today. Do you want to unpack that a bit for us, Jay?
Absolutely. I mean, in many ways, Economics of Mutuality was inspired by the Jubilee, the concept of the Jubilee, which is really coming out of the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, which is all about how land, labor, and capital should be remunerated with Shabbat or Sabbath, which is really about rest, that you can actually remunerate these other forms of capital with rest. For the people, for the labor, it's really 1 day of rest out of every 7. For the land, it's letting the land lay fallow for 1 year out of every 7. And then for financial capital, which is really about creating liquidity in the system, it was about there being a reset every 49 years for 1 year. So that's the 50-year Jubilee cycle, where debt is forgiven and the captives are set free, people return to their homes. And this idea of remuneration through rest of the different forms of capital is sort of central to the underpinnings of what we're doing, although we don't sort of focus on that because we work in a secular environment and in a secular world of business. And so we have a secular vernacular around all of this. But from a personal perspective, a personal belief system, I believe that Jubilee is central to this work, and that it's a living, breathing blueprint. I mean, who would have thought the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament would be a living, breathing, active blueprint for the way the kingdom economy should really function? But that's how I personally feel, as a believer.
It's interesting. Right now, the South African government is voting on this issue of land expropriation without compensation. So the government can come in and take your land, and it's been in the Jakub family for a couple 100 years or whatever, but they just decide, no, we're going to take it away, and they could do it without compensation, which goes against the principles that you've just talked about. And because property ownership was a big deal. So what made the Promised Land different from Egypt was that they actually owned capital, a means of production. And God wanted to see that restored to people. So everybody had an economic base. That's one angle. But my other thought on that, as I've reflected on that, is the notion of upskilling. So let's just say the Jakub family has got a bustling vineyard enterprise, and the Johnson family next door are just rubbish farmers. We aren't any good. We don't have much skill and so on. So you end up buying our land during this period for as many years as there are harvests until, but built into that is an upskilling. I learned to be a better farmer from the Jakub enterprise. I learned to be, so I think that there was an upskilling built in, almost a business incubator, an upskilling built into the concept of Jubilee. Did you unpack that much in your work?
I can't say that I have personally, and from you're using an analogy of South Africa that I'm not really familiar with because I don't know very much about South Africa at all. So I imagine there's a lot of other factors at play in that example. But I would say that it's not Economics of Mutuality isn't a literal activation of every aspect of Jubilee, but it's very much inspired by that concept. And we do think that it's a good guide and way forward. That's all I would say about that topic.
Yeah, I loved your point about the different forms of capital experiencing different forms of rest, laborers getting rest, land getting rest, and so on. And this is a big deal. When the nation of Israel ended up in exile, there was a complaint, if you like, from God that the land hadn't experienced rest for 390 years. It's like, who knew God was an accountant keeping track of those things, but he had anticipated that there would be a rest for the land. This was a big deal to him. And so contrary to this notion of exploitation that we often see in the world of business. So I love the mutuality perspective. What it means, go ahead, Jay.
I'm just going to make a comment that we actually did some research about kibbutzes, the operation of kibbutzes in Israel early on, and we discovered that there are kibbutzes in Israel that operate their farms along this Jubilee concept of letting the land lay fallow for 1 year and out of every 7. And what the farmers have actually been experiencing is a significant uptick in the yield just before they allow the land to lay fallow, and then a tripling of the yield in the year after. So back in year 1 of the next cycle, after they've let the land lay at rest for a year. So basically, the land is providing the resource to get through that time that they're allowing it to rest. And the observation, again, from a personal perspective, as a believer, when we ignore the Sabbath, when we ignore that mandated rest period, we really create significant risk for ourselves. And I think it was the ancient Israelites, when they were taken into captivity, the Babylonian captivity, it was for 70 years, which I believe equated with the number of years that the Sabbaths were ignored. So that's not insignificant, I think.
Well, that's very interesting. And I love the fact that built into that concept of Sabbath is a dependence on God. It's a faith, so business is a life of faith, and you're going to have to trust that the 6th year is going to be a bumper year, and it's going to carry you through. So this concept of trust, and I once, said to a group of people, I've only had one person disagree with me, that risk and faith are two sides of the same coin, and that God is a risk taker. And this one lady, an accountant, was at a big company, told me, no, God doesn't take any risks. I said to her, go look in the mirror. He's willing to, which he does too. And so I think risk and faith go hand in hand. And I think in the business world, we say no business. And even nowadays we say this is science or this is economics, meaning it's logic without faith. And that's just, do you have a view on that? It sounds like that's just so opposite of the economics of mutuality.
Well, I guess the how I would explain this myself is that, when we started this work, it looked extraordinarily difficult. I mean, impossible, really. That who were we to play any role whatsoever in transforming the global economy, the way businesses operate, out of this small think tank of this very discreet family company that made M&Ms, among other things. And at every step of the pathway had to be one of faith, actually, because when John Mars asked that question, what should the right level of profit be? He asked that question 18 months before the big global economic crisis of 2008. So at that time, people were not challenging the predominancy of financial capitalism. There just weren't people out there that were saying, the system is dysfunctional and it needs to be either replaced or significantly evolved to meet the new conditions of the new economy. And so we had a head start in this area, but we didn't have a lot of support at first. In fact, we had a lot of opposition. People didn't want to try to fix something that they didn't think was broken. But the global economic crisis, 2008, really shocked business leaders and created a lot more support for thinking that, hey, maybe the context of the global economy has changed so materially that we need to do something about the business model. And so that kind of gave us more support. But just finding the right partners, having the right resources at the right time, overcoming what seemed to be impossible obstacles, just trying to do something like measure social capital when there are over 100 variables that together could describe a social capital space. That's far too complex for business. But ultimately, we discovered to our delight that there were only 3, the ones I mentioned earlier, trust, social cohesiveness, and the capacity to work collectively, that in every field experiment that we ran in any part of the world, from Papua New Guinea, impoverished coffee farmers, to farmers in East Africa, to distributors of chewing gum in Vietnam, wherever we did this, we found that there were only 3 variables out of the 100 or so, 60 to 100, that always accounted for about 80% of any social capital space. Greatly simplified and standardized this and made it useful for business. And yet we couldn't have foreseen that, which I think was why businesses had never tried in the past to work with social capital, because they thought it's just comparing apples to oranges, it's too complex, we'll never be able to do this. And so every step on this journey has been one of trust. And because they're just, the obstacles have been too big. So it reminded me personally, again, at a very personal level, of the story of Gideon. Gideon was the least of his family, which was the least of the village, which was the tribe that was the least of the tribes of the Israelites. And yet Gideon was called upon to do something extraordinary. And then he was even told to get rid of a lot of the people he recruited to help him do that, so that there would be no confusion about who was actually in charge and who was who was there to do it. So I haven't lost any perspective on who's in charge and who should get the glory for this. It's not us.
Yeah. It's fascinating because, one of the things that I think one can challenge business people with is measuring the things that look immeasurable. I remember going in with a group of companies in Cape Town some years ago, and I said, okay, let's just look at the people aspect of your business without looking at the financials. If you walked through a factory, walked through the business, what would be the indicators that people are functioning in their purpose, are well aligned, are working from a vocational instead of just an occupation? And we came up with over 40 indicators that you could come up with by observation. And it took me back to, there was a period of time I was working at Pricewaterhouse, but I ended up running a local church at the same time. And I figured you could actually measure intangibles like the presence of God, like was God present in a meeting? Because I could preach a sermon that was technically correct, but if God didn't show up, you say amen, and people are gone in 2 minutes. They disappeared. But you could preach a rubbish sermon, and if God showed up, they would hang around afterwards and talk for half an hour. And I began to, and I have friends in business who did the same thing. Figured if they were doing what they should be doing, people would come across their path. They would have an increase of coincidences. They would have these kind of connections. And you can start to measure those things, the soft things, as it were, and they all begin to add up, and you see the patterns, which I love that you've done. And I look forward to reading some of your work on this. Back in the day, we developed a model called, which we still use, the 10P model, 10 drivers of corporate impact back in the day when there were just really 3: product, price, and service. And our first one was purpose. And so we began measuring that back in the mid-1990s. And we see it driving innovation. We see it bringing alignment, as you've spoken about, getting companies to have a big enough purpose that will pull all of the stakeholders together. If you're not pulling them all together, you don't have a big enough purpose.
Maybe I can make a comment, Brett, about purpose, say a little bit more about that, because that's so central to what we're doing as well, because ultimately it starts with purpose and ends with purpose. So how do we put purpose into practice through strategy? And C.S. Lewis wrote something really amazing about purpose in one of his more obscure writings, which was purpose is like a light, and you don't turn the light on in a dark room and then stare at the light. Okay, and I love this quote, because it really helps me explain that most corporations today, they look at purpose, which is the light, and they give ownership of it to corporate affairs and communications, which then uses it to get people to focus on the light and to stare at it, because it's not connected to strategy very often, and it's not connected to the incentive systems of the corporation to deliver that purpose. So a disconnected purpose is like trying to get external consumers and customers and governments to stare at the light and be inspired by it, so that you buy more of the product of the company. What I think Lewis was talking about, as it translates into what we're doing with Economics of Mutuality, is that the purpose is the light that illuminates the challenges, the opportunities, the pain points, as I mentioned earlier, among the stakeholders that you've gathered together around that purpose to help you as a business deliver that purpose. And it's through the illumination of using the purpose to illuminate the challenges that you then know what to target to heal, so that you make the stakeholders more performant in that ecosystem to deliver the purpose that you say your company stands for. And there's been some great research over the years, including by a friend of mine named Raj Sisodia, who helped co-found the conscious capitalism movement, if you've heard about that.
Yeah.
And Raj, I forgot the name of his book now, but he wrote a book back in 2011 that cited some very interesting data that showed that companies that actually are delivering their purpose, what they say their purpose are actually more profitable and more resilient and more sustainable than companies that do not. And there's an increasing body of knowledge on that demonstrates the same thing. So if you put purpose into practice through strategy, then you are going to be more profitable, you're going to be more responsible, you're going to be more purposeful, and you're going to be more resilient. And so why shouldn't companies focus on that?
Yeah. I would imagine one of the challenges you've alluded to, Jay, is that you hand this over to corporate affairs, to the PR people, to the advertising, marketing people. And so if senior leaders delegate purpose, then it can become packaging, branding, and what you end up doing is attracting bugs to the light rather than eliminating the problems, as you pointed out. And so I would imagine that becomes a bit of a problem where branding there's almost strategy by branding, and branding becomes a little more overblown than it should be in today's world. Do you see that with the younger companies or not really?
Well, I think that there's been an increasing amount of consensus among business leaders of companies of all sizes, especially during this COVID period now, that it's time for business to focus more on purpose than on profitability. The problem is that's consensus around the why things should change. Where there's very little consensus still is on the how to do it. And so that's where I think economics of mutuality is an opportunity for companies to see that there's at least one way that is very different than the way they've been doing business, and it answers the question of how to become more purposeful. And by becoming more purposeful, you don't have to sacrifice your traditional performance. You actually can enhance your traditional performance. But as the former chief economist of Mars likes to say, when you don't chase the money, it chases you. And when we deliver economics of mutuality in a business model innovation way, we find actually that performance, as measured traditionally in terms of retained earnings, often doubles. But you can't be chasing it. You have to be focused on the means, how you treat the others, rather than the ends, how you profit by that. And when you're faithful in those things, you wind up getting a double blessing. I guess that's the easiest way for me to understand and explain it. It actually does work that way.
Jay, just as we head towards a close over here, some of your best examples of companies where you've seen this worked out. An XYZ company did it and they saw these kind of benefits.
I mean, we're working in a number of different companies now because Mars did something quite extraordinary last year. We had convinced the Mars family and the leadership team of Mars some time ago that economics of mutuality is too big for one company because it really can be transformational, and it's something that you would call in business a non-rival good. So it's something that actually would benefit Mars more by sharing it than it would be by just burying it into intellectual property. So one of the constraints we were under being inside Mars, working for the internal think tank there, was we couldn't really work with other companies. We had to, all of our work was with Mars initially. Well, we then convinced them to allow us last year to move outside of the company, to basically spin out and become an independent EOM foundation based in Geneva, Switzerland, that in a very hybrid way owns an EOM solutions consultancy, neither of which have shareholders. So that insulates us from profit motive, but the profits that are generated by delivering economics mutuality to different companies in different sectors of the economy has to be reinvested in growing the capability or transferred to the nonprofit, which does the advocacy, builds the global movement, the research and development, and so forth. So now we started working with multiple other companies, and there are some examples in that space. I'm not at liberty to talk about all of our clients, just because some of that is confidential. One company that's not a client of ours, but I love to use them as an example because it's exactly kind of what we're talking about with purpose, is a Scandinavian company that makes insulin, which is called Novo Nordisk, one of the biggest producers of insulin in the world. And I like to use this example, especially when teaching economics of mutuality, because it really shows how you can repurpose yourself from where Novo Nordisk was for many years, which was what was called a descriptive purpose. So their purpose as a company was to sell more insulin. Okay, so it was basically to profit by treating the symptoms of a disease. And it didn't differentiate them at all from their competition. Then they had this kind of epiphany that they needed to repurpose themselves in a very counterintuitive way for a company that made all of its money on selling insulin, which was to solve diabetes. So
Right.
they moved from this kind of internally focused, I want to sell more insulin to make more money off of the problem, to I want to be part of the solution of the underlying disease, of curing the underlying disease. Now, you could extrapolate out from that and say, if we're successful, then we'll be out of business because we won't be able to sell any insulin. There won't be any customers anymore. But it so moved the stakeholders in that ecosystem because they saw Novo Nordisk is in it for the right reason, alongside them in the war on diabetes itself, that they became the preferred provider of insulin. They wanted to partner with and buy their insulin from Novo Nordisk. And Novo Nordisk's behavior changed as well. And they started looking at very different kinds of initiatives to help educate people, to get them adopting behaviors that would actually help cure their diabetes and theoretically reduce the demand for insulin. But nonetheless, they became a much more resilient, sustainable, and profitable business over time because they were doing the right thing. And I think that's a great example of a company that is operating along this premise that underlies what we're trying to do here.
Very good, Jay. Very good example. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Great. So closing advice to the CEO who's saying, oh, Jay, I'm a little afraid that if I go down this road, it's a slippery slope. Give them a finger, they'll take the hand. Soon my arm will be gone. And yeah, I kind of want to do good with my business, but they have some reservations. What would your closing comments be?
Your fear is misplaced. That if you have anything to fear, it's doing nothing, doing things the way that you've always done them, because the world has changed dramatically. The context of the global economy has changed. Economies evolve just like everything else. And we've now evolved from what used to be called the services economy or the financial economy, which the rules of the game favored accumulating the commoditized money, basically the financial capital, as much as you could possibly accumulate. Those rules of the game changed 20, 30 years ago already, and we've moved into what's called the knowledge economy or the services economy or the digital economy, where other forms of capital like social capital, which get you the access to the knowledge that you need to do what it is you want to do. You don't even have to own that. That's becoming much more comparatively valuable than financial capital, which is in such excess that it's not underpinned by anything of value. Mm-hmm. So you need to start to think about these other forms of capital. And by the way, you don't have to trade your profitability to do that. Yeah. That stepping up to do good for people and planet actually can be more profitable than not doing that, than doing things the old way. So it's time to wake up and to realize that the world has changed and the model needs to be modified and upgraded substantially. And if you don't, you're going to be stuck holding the bag, because when people lose confidence in the value of money, the value of money could drop overnight in this world of instant communications by 70%. Who knows? And if you don't have the means to measure and manage and mobilize the other forms of capital, which can release more financial value anyway, then you're going to be way behind, and you may not survive the transition. So, start to think about a more complete form of capitalism and embrace it now, because now's the time, and time is short.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, Jay, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom with us. It's been a delight speaking with you, and appreciate the work you've been doing. And we'll go and check out Economics of Mutuality, EOM.org, and the books you recommend there. And Completing Capitalism, I recommend it to those who are listening. It's an excellent read. And I love the book, love the title. And Jay, as the saying goes, healed people heal people. So thank you for the work you're doing, and look forward to hearing more of that progress and seeing that filter into companies around the world.
Thank you, Brett, and the best of luck with your podcast series. I know it's reaching a lot of people, and it's a very important topic you're tackling. So thanks for having me on today.